All right. My name is Steve Avery, and I run a company called DCAA Compliance, which is out of Albuquerque here, although I have clients all across the country and across the world a little bit too. So what I mainly do is work with contractors when they're starting out to make sure that they're complying with the requirements and the regulation and help them get some good financial management going. And then I will, when they get their first cost type contract or their first DCAA auditors, they've heard they're coming up, I get a lot of calls then. So like I'm traveling back and forth between Saudi Arabia right now on a Saudi contractor who got their first cost type contract, so we're working on that. And then the other thing I get called on a lot is when contractors get into trouble and the government either wants millions of dollars back or doesn't want to pay millions of dollars, and they'll ask me to come in and see if there's something I can do about that. I've been fairly successful with that over the years. So far I've recovered several $1 million for contractors. Up until last week, I had never lost one, so to speak. But I had a contractor that had to pay $80,000 last year, which I got it down from $350, so I felt fairly good. But it was the first time I ever had a contract in 25 years. I've ever had a contractor write a check. I'm still trying to get over that. So I apologize. Jada here is going to be running is from Arrowhead, and she's going to be running the part of the slide projectors and help us with that. And what we're going to talk about today is the real world of government contracting. Wish is out dealing with a emergency phone call he got. He'll be back in here in a few moments. Hopefully less intense than the one we did a couple of weeks ago. Mainly what I want to try and address is to what you really need to know, what you really don't need to know, when you need to call for help. Owning your proposing your accounting system. I think, and actually at the SBIR conference, was December, was it? Mm-hmm. Somebody actually said on one of the panels, don't worry about the budgets. Don't worry about it. Well, I mean anything about it. To a certain extent, that's historically been true, especially on SBIR ones, but it's getting less and less true. A lot of the agencies now, because they don't have access to the auditing resources they used to have, are actually wanting contractors to turn in monthly cost reports, just like you were, which you don't even have to do. Lockheed Martin doesn't have to turn in a monthly cost report on most of its contracts, but SBIR ones are now being asked to do that. That includes all of their direct costs and their indirect rates on a monthly basis, which of course is sort of an invoice, which is what a cost type invoice does. So it sort of replaces that. Then, you have to decide what the driving factor in a government contractor accounting system should be what works for the contractor. Secondary is what works for the government. You have to give the government what they want. And the analogy I use is, a lot of contractors I come into set up their books used to like the IRS Schedule C. Say, this is the way the IRS does it, so that's what I want to do it. Well, the IRS's job is to maximize you paying taxes. They don't really care whether you're in business next year or not. They just want the paperwork so that they can figure out how much money you owe. What you need is financial information to run your business. And that also involves, but at the same time, you got to give the government what they want. Okay, and then what resources are available to help with that, which we have. We're very fortunate in New Mexico to have Arrowhead here, New Mexico Pass, and and also I enjoy work not having to go to Saudi Arabia. It's a lot more fun sometimes just to go down the street. So, okay, so we'll start out with talking about ownership again. Let's see. All right. So nobody seems to start a business because they enjoy bookkeeping, except possibly a bookkeeper. Nobody. I had one client here in Albuquerque who years ago said, I don't want to do any of this stuff. Whenever DCA or anybody would call, he said, call Steve. That's and I would yell at him. I said, you got to deal with this stuff. I'm not going to do this stuff unless you know what I'm doing. So finally, his wife started taking over, and but she ended up 5 years later, became a CPA. She went back to school, got paid. And I said, well, I corrupted her. So, but one of the things that I do with my clients, and one of the things I encourage clients to do, is to have a monthly finance meeting. One client I do here in town, we have it at quarters each month over beer and scotch, you know, and we'll go over the books and make sure that they work, that everything's working. Okay. So part of the reasons for this are because, you know, and one of the reasons for this is accounting software like QuickBooks sort of gives you the impression that, you know, it does everything and you don't have to know anything. You just put the stuff into QuickBooks and everything will be right. And to be absolutely true, QuickBooks is a very powerful accounting system. Very powerful. It's in some ways too powerful. They've gotten better over the years, but you know, 15, 20 years ago, you could do anything in QuickBooks. Now at least you can set up some internal controls that make it a little bit better. Like I had one client that whenever a subcontractor invoice would come in 3 or 4 months late, they would just go ahead and put it in. You know, this was in April, they would put the invoice back in January. They'd already billed the government for January, so they ended up never billing the government for the invoice. But they paid it, you know, because it showed up on their accounts payable. And so it really will not handle everything. It'll help quite a bit. It'll make it possible. We had a guy named Bert who came here and spoke at Popejoy Hall about 30 years ago. He's a futurist. He did a couple of series called Connections and The Day the Universe Changed. Probably nobody knows. And one of the things he said, and this is about 30 years ago here, he said that the personal computer would replace the bachelor's degree. And in terms of the accounting profession, that has to a certain extent become true. The software will do a lot, but it will not do everything, and you still need to know what's going on. Here's the other problem. I have 3 kids who graduated from one of the better high schools here in Albuquerque, and they were all required to take economics, and none of them were taught learn how to do bookkeeping. You know, none of them were required to learn bookkeeping, even personal bookkeeping they're not taught in high school. Why in the world does it need to do economics if I have to explain to my daughter who's a PhD candidate in Chicago how to write a check over the phone because she's never written a check before? So that's part of it also. All right, so with that in mind, now before we get into a long discussion the rest of the day, what you shouldn't know, I want to show you how simple this was for people years ago. This is a video that I rescued. It's not very high resolution, but this is about 10 minutes, and you can watch it on my YouTube channel. We'll watch part of it here. You know, 10 years ago, you could watch this tells you almost everything you need to know about bookkeeping in 10 minutes. How about the sound? We're not getting sound.
Oh. No.
Okay, we may watch less of it even than I thought. Okay, don't know. Didn't have this problem last time we were here when we tested it before. Okay, all right. I'm going to hold off on this at the moment. We'll go ahead and proceed. So this video is available off of if you put basic accounting principles or DCAA compliance on YouTube, it'll lead you to this video. And this video basically is from 1962. It's about a kid who rents out lawnmowers to other kids to mow lawns with, and he sells his business when he graduates from high school. So his dad tells him how to create a balance sheet and an income statement, and he teaches the guy who buys his business how to keep the books. And in 10 minutes, you learn stuff that I spend hundreds of hours trying to teach people over the years. So I'll encourage everybody to look at that, and that'll make up for starting late on this.
We'll send it out too in a follow-up email.
Okay, so we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about strange comments that I've heard contractors make over the years, and strange comments that I've had auditors make over the years, to sort of give you an idea about, start developing you a warn eye, a spider sense maybe, so that you could start detecting when I'm handling this and when I'm not handling this and when it's going on. And one of the first things I will tell you, even though I'm going to spend the first part criticizing contractors, is a lot of times it's the government's fault. If something the government asks you for you're uncomfortable with and you don't feel correct about, you're usually correct. And then the other thing I will tell you, well, we'll get to it in a little bit, but I'll tell you also is research is a big part of it because these rules change all the time. All right. So here's one we do here. We don't need to have a good accounting system. We don't need to have a good accounting structure. We bid the rates that will win the contract and we still make a profit. Okay. And that is true of a lot of small businesses. That's a valid statement to make. However, if you understand your costs, if you understand what your real rates are, that I will argue will give you some advantages. If you don't understand what your rates are, what your real costs, and your competitor does, then I will argue that they've got an advantage over you. I told this story last time. I'll tell it again. I had a client bidding on a Sandia thing, on a Dutch auction thing they do at Sandia. And we had sat there, we'd agreed beforehand, this is the lowest price they could go. If they went below this price, it wasn't going to be worth it. Sure enough, bidding got below it, and they dropped out. And I was so proud of them. I was so absolutely proud of them that they had dropped out and decided that they couldn't do, that they did resist the temptation and keep on going down bidding that contract. I was even happier when 3 days later, Sandia came back and gave them the contract. So, because the other one ended up not being able to do it at that price. Okay, so we are too small for the government to care about. That is sort of true, but sort of not true. It just really depends on the mood of the government that day. Like I said earlier, with these SBIR1 reporting requirements that a lot of agencies are coming up with, they may not care about you, but they're still going to bury you in paperwork. The other thing is too, is that if they're looking for something easy to do, then if they've got a contractor with 500 employees and a contract with five employees, at the moment they're counting audits done, not complexity of the audits. In fact, they're having to deal with that. It's taking them 800 hours on average to complete an audit. All right. You obviously, hopefully nobody in this room or online would be somebody that they're spending 800 hours to do an audit for. So some of these auditors have figured out that if they do 20 small audits, they can get 20 audits done in 800 hours instead of getting one big one done. So they're doing the small ones. And we're seeing that just happens, but it's not. 10 years ago, I would have told you that was always true. Now I will admit that it's a little more inconsistent than it used to be. Here's the other one. Here are our policies and procedures. Have a nice day. I had one client in South Carolina who bought a set of policies and procedures off the internet. This was before I wrote my book. Didn't even read them, handed them to DCAA. He was an R&D company developing technology for aircraft maintenance. The policies and procedures he handed them was for a manufacturing company, manufacturing farm equipment. So you can guess how that went. That took quite a while for me to clean up. Again, we get back to ownership. I can overwhelm the government with policies and procedures, but one of the requirements I have, and Dana's been through this with me with a couple of people at FAST, is I require the clients to have an understanding of what we're talking about. When I set up a policy and procedure, I explain to you why you have to do it, and I have a book on this. It's a guaranteed cure for insomnia. If you want to buy my book, that book on Amazon, it gives you all the regulations, why you have to have a policy and procedure, and then it gives you a model policy and procedure. Again, it's about empowerment. Okay, here's the other one. We have not gotten around writing down our policies and procedures. That's never a good one to tell them if you're getting an accounting system on it, because the response is, well, then we can't approve your accounting system. It's just absolutely that simple. They have what's called the Contract Audit Manual, which is roughly a 2,000-page manual that the auditors have on how to audit contractors. Chapter 5, which is about 300 pages of that 2,000 pages, is 100% dedicated to policies and procedures. It is down at the moment and unavailable. They are rewriting it, probably in response, hopefully, to my books. I'm hoping, but we'll see. We'll see what happens when the new one comes out. I will say sometimes they come out and it's a major innovation, a major improvement. Sometimes it comes out and there's a couple of typos they correct it, and that's it. So we'll figure. But it's been down for a couple of months now. It's been down since December. So we're trying to figure out what's going on. But you have to write down policies and procedures, and they have to make sense to you. You have to own them. You have to follow them. That's the other thing. That's like, yeah, very much.
That's not easy. There's a lot of little things, and you have to make sure you're following it. Because if they audit and look at it, they will ask you for it. And when they ask you for it, you better ask.
Especially in terms of labor issues. And I try and make it so that they're common sense and easy to follow. That's possible too. I try and sort through the regulations, the guidance, especially like subcontractor management, because they'll kill you to death on subcontractor management. And I've actually managed to reduce that down to a 2 or 3 page model policy that complies with everything that the regulation requires. Here's another one that they tell auditors all the time.
On that same thing, one other thing is, don't try to make it onerous. Okay?
Yeah.
So if you're trying to do internal audits or something like that, do it where you know you will do it at a reasonable time. Okay. Don't sit there and say, I do my equipment audit now once a month or some nonsense for that. You'll very soon find out you won't be doing anything else.
Well, and that
getting into other things. So be careful as to how you do that. And what I tell my guys is all the things that are timeline based from your policies and procedures, put a little Excel sheet and have things that come up as to when these things are due. It's much easier to follow that and check the boxes for them. So you don't have to go through the manual again and say, okay, I did this for accounting, I did this for manufacturing or whatever.
well, there's 2 comments to that. Along the lines of making it common sense. Like, give an example, when I have employees check W-2 and I check all the personnel stuff, it's in April, after everybody's filed their taxes and probably should change their W-2 because they just got their taxes done. So then we may take something and make it common sense that actually does some good. The other important part to remember is the government has 4,000 auditors in the DCAA. Who knows how many contracting people, how many projects people, everything. None of them have done, almost none of them have done what you have done. All right, here's another one. I don't have a copy of any of this. Okay, it's very, I've heard contractors will say that time and time again. I don't have a copy of my policy procedures. I don't have a copy of that invoice. I don't have a copy of that contract. Whatever, they will say that, and that always gets them into trouble. Now, there are times when you should not provide them copies, and we'll talk about that a little bit also. There are things they ask for copies of that they shouldn't ask for copies of, but in general, you have to be showing an attitude that you're cooperating with. And but if you're routinely saying, I don't have a copy of this, no, sorry, not that, then they get the idea that they're not welcome there. And if they're not welcome there, then that can mean bad things for you. Okay, this is another common thing, and there's a lot of argument with this too. My tax accountant says my books are fine. Well, one thing, most small businesses keep their tax books on a cash basis, which is fine. Everybody, absolutely, you should file your tax return on a cash basis, but the government requires the government contracting reports to be on an accrued basis. You know, QuickBooks has now made, the latest version of QuickBooks has now made it a button on the top, supposedly where you can switch back between cash and accrued. I haven't checked to see how accurate it is. I've had some problems with it in the past, but that's it. But your book can be perfectly fine for tax purposes and be a total wreck for government contracting. I had a bizarre one a couple of years ago. The auditor showed up. He didn't show up the first time. I had to fly out to Phoenix twice. Second time he showed up, he had on a nice sports jacket with one of those, like a yachting jacket with one of those crests over the shoulder. And then I looked a little closely at the crest, and it said accounting club. DCAA, if I ever put this one in writing, DCAA will come after me with an axe. This was a government employee, a government auditor, who was wearing this accounting club jacket. And he went on this rampage about cash accounting. And the tax accountant was there, and he said, and he gave him the same speech that I just gave, and said, so you got that too, but you've got to have an accrued set of books for government contracting because you've got to comply with GAAP, and GAAP 99% of the time is accrued. All right. Okay, here's this one. These ones are sort of merged together, so I put them here. Most of this is simply none of their business. I deal with that attitude a lot with contractors. Where they say, no, they can know what they know in this contract. Goes back to the commercial stuff a little bit too. They shouldn't know it. What I make is none of their business because I'm not charging my time to this contract. But then usually you are through G&A. I like this one too. I'm an honest, hardworking citizen, and of course they have to approve me. I a client once that had this critical technology that the government was desperate to get. It was absolutely critical, and they needed it, they needed it, they needed it. And so the Army issued a contract, the Air Force issued a contract without waiting for the government, the auditors to show up and audit them. The auditors came up and canceled the contract. And it ended up being this huge fight that I was in the middle of for like 6 months, them trying to figure out, you know, how they were going to get this work. And of course, there was an easy solution to it, which was issue a fixed price contract. But then that would admit they were wrong to issue a cost like contract. The worst, they weren't going to do that. So, so the auditors don't care how important your work is or how honest you are. And then again, it's not a question. It's not that they question your integrity. It's just you're responsible for demonstrating it. I mean, we're talking about taxpayers' monies here. You're supposed to be able to demonstrate that you're using taxpayers' money in a reasonable, responsible manner. If you are unable to do so, I think I told this case last time I was one in California a couple of years ago, where the people said the government owed them $1 million, and DCAA said, these guys don't have an accounting system. We have no way of knowing whether they're owed any of this money or not. So we can't figure this out. If they can put together a set of books that tells us what they actually did, then we'll figure out what you should pay them. All right, here's another one. I understand accounting. And wish actually had number 2 here. So it's not supposed to happen per direct order anymore, but apparently it still happens. Yeah, I wish I understand accounting, or the auditors will help me fix any problems I have, or I have spreadsheets.
Not fix, but I would suggest.
Yeah, they're not even supposed to do that anymore. They're not even supposed to do that. 15 years ago, they did it all the time. It was really nice. They did it all the time. They would say, to be honest with you, DCMA, not DCAA, but DCMA has been known to pick up to tell the contractor, call this contractor who's down the street from you. And they don't do it in Albuquerque. I don't want to imply Albuquerque DCAA does this, but in other places, they call this contractor down the street from you and see how they got all of this stuff fixed. And of course, it's one of my clients. And so I've gotten 10 or 15 clients that way through backdoor recommendations from DCMA. But as a general rule, it doesn't happen. Spreadsheets are not an accounting system. I have a Dilbert cartoon I should have probably put on here, where the Ascot, the intern, is working on a budget spreadsheet, and Dilbert walks up behind him and says, you know, one little mistake will completely destroy your spreadsheet. Do you mind if I stand behind you and whistle? You know, and spreadsheets, unless they're set up by people who really understand accounting, which is 99% of the people who don't set up spreadsheets don't fit that category, are not double entry. They don't have the controls to improve accuracy. You'll find more mistakes in spreadsheets than anything else, and people do way too much accounting in spreadsheets. I've also thought that we're going to have a major recession once caused by Excel spreadsheets, and maybe we already have and just hadn't known it. So that pretty much, I think, concludes the comments I have about strange contracts by contractors. But I want to sort of give you this idea that this is serious, but doable. If you take it seriously, you can do it. If you take it seriously, you can do it. And when to call for help, when to say, and that a lot of times that could just simply be Googling, you know. Now we're going to talk about strange comments made by DCA and government contracting officers and others. So this is one that happened here in Albuquerque a couple of years ago by a supervisor here in the DCA office, where we were sitting there, and the client was a small client, three physicists, and they were showing the DCA auditors how we'd just gone to lunch, how they came back from lunch, they had taken a picture of their receipt. They sent it to a account called receipts@ourcompany.com, and then the guy took it from there, entered it into the accounting system, attached the receipt onto the voucher in QuickBooks, the entire process. You know, absolutely, I thought, going perfectly. And the supervisor goes, you know, you have to have that scanning system approved by DCMA. And I almost went, what? But instead I went, oh, you know, I said, I'm not really sure I've heard that requirement. She goes, oh, yeah, you have to have your accounting system approved by DCMA. And I said, could you give me a FAR reference on that? And she goes, well, I don't know what it is off the top of my head. For 3 weeks, I pestered her on that until she finally admitted that there was no such reference. and that it was what I call water cooling auditing, where they talk about it around the water cooler and they think that's the way it should be, and all of a sudden there's a regulation exists for that. Another example of that is I have this happen fairly often, is auditors will tell contractors that they can only rent economy cars, that the regulations say that. Regulations don't say that. In fact, in my book, I have a picture from Expedia, you know, where you go to rent your car, if you go to Expedia, rent your car, and it's got the economy car up on top, and it's got an SUV for less per day at the bottom to illustrate that. And, you know, what you're supposed to do is be reasonable and prudent, not necessarily, and if there's not a regulation, there's not a regulation. Okay, so these are examples of DCAA auditors, and this is worse for contracting and programs people because they don't have any training on these issues, but they will still come to you with this stuff. And they say, okay, without adequate knowledge, do you have a question? Or no? Okay, I'm sorry. They don't know the statutes, the regulations, or even their own guidance. That's what I call it, water cooler auditors. I heard this around the water cooler, so yeah, it must be true. Now, another example of DCAA auditors making stuff. We're going to need copies of the birth certificates for all employee spouses and employee children on the company health plan. I had a client who got that request in California. Within a week, I got another request from an auditor in Hawaii that wanted copies of all the I-9s, including the backup documents for the I-9s. And most I-9s have Social Security cards as backup and driver's licenses as backups. And then
that didn't come for me from DCAA, but I just had that about 6 months ago from Homeland Security. The first time I ever,
like I said, they're coming back from other areas because they just don't have.
I've never had this since 2003. I've been doing this, right?
Yeah.
15 years.
Well,
the first time I've seen it, they wanted the I-9s, but everything. In fact, they wanted the originals. They won't even take copies.
Well, and see that.
I had to give it to them because there was nothing much I could do.
Well,
Back 3 months later, saying you have no. A couple other.
There's actually an internal regulation that prohibits them from asking for that. Well, I understand, but once I pointed out the internal regulation that prohibits them from asking for that, they gave up on it. And the I-9 case, what we ended up doing is you can come and look at them. You can do what's an in-camera review. You can look at them in the office, but you cannot make copies unless you can guarantee in writing how you're going to handle my employees' personal information. And they backed off there. The birth certificate ones, we just said, no, find me a regulation that says do that. The other ones that happens are the driver's license. I had that happen in Atlanta a couple of years. They wanted 500 copies of 500 employees' driver's license to prove that they were real for payroll. And like I said, I found an internal regulation that actually prohibits them from doing this kind of crap, and that's how I solved most of this. But what the point is that you just get, sometimes I think these are auditors who think that they have copies of everything, they're doing a good job instead of actually doing an alternate. So for example, the audit procedure where they ask for the I-9s says in the audit procedure that if the contractor doesn't want to provide them, then use alternative procedures. And so I suggested alternative procedures, and they went along with in Hawaii, they went along with the alternative procedures. But they're exceeding their authority in this case. They do not have the authority to ask for that. And it used to be easier, depends what it just happened to you, but when I was getting this happening a lot 4 years ago, that was when all their personal information had been hacked. When the Office of Personnel Management had been hacked, and most government employees' information be hacked. So I said, well, listen, your information's being hacked. Why should we let you hack theirs? They don't have any way of dealing with these copies. The most common thing, even today in 2017, I hear from a government auditor is all of the work papers for the previous audits have disappeared. So every time you hand them this stuff, those copies go somewhere and you have no idea where they're going to go. Okay. Now this is one where it's fairly common too, is where they don't know how to read. The regulation says that accounts payable should normally, the regulation says normally be paid within 30 days of payment by the government. But the auditors read have to be paid within 30 days, and that gets in their head. And I've actually had them try to disapprove accounting systems based on that because they didn't pay the bills within 30 days, even though they hadn't read the regulation. This is my most famous one of all time. I have a cartoon on this one up on my website. I had a DCAA supervisor in North Carolina who absolutely said that the contractor's accounting system was unreliable because if they were filling out their timesheet and typed in a 4 and realized it should have been a 3, they didn't have a policy that told them to go back and get a supervisor before they hit the backspace key and turned it to a 3. And he actually wrote that up, and I had to go to that was the only time I ever gone to the OIG. I went to the Office of Inspector General, and the OIG solved it, and the contractor got their accounting system approved. But I was not very happy about that one. So these are examples of auditors not understanding the regulation. Where that guy had sort of gotten that from is that here we are in 2017. We've had electronic timesheets probably for 20 years. I mean, I think Deltek had timesheets at least 20, 25 years ago. Deltek had an electric timesheet with government contracting. And the government still has no guidance on how to do electronic timesheets. The only guidance the government's ever written up on doing timesheets is on manual timesheets and time cards or badges. That is the only guidance they have for their auditors on how to audit for those policies and procedures and how to do a labor check. So during this process, I got annoyed enough with this auditor where I said, okay, you're trying to apply the manual timekeeping practices to electric timekeeping. You know, by saying, because, you know, what you have to do with manual one, if you find a mistake, you have to mark it out, initial it, and put the next one and have your supervisor initial it. So he's trying to apply that principle to electronic timekeeping. That's where this came from. I said, what? Are you prohibiting them? Next thing you're going to do is prohibit them from using whiteout on a computer screen? You know, because that same guidance prohibits them from using whiteout. Okay, I'm ranting. Yes, I am ranting. That's what I do. So what? All right. This is a critical one when I put this one up in a forum once a couple of years ago, put up a discussion about this. I had one guy who just went ballistic on me, and another good auditor from a guy who does what I do, a consultant that does what I do. He says, I don't know why he went crazy on you, but you know, apparently you're just having a bad day. The government will say that the burden of proof is on you and not them. That if they don't like something, you've got to prove that it's okay. And that's really not true, okay? The burden of proof, when the first thing, they have to, if they make that assertion, they have to base it on one of 4 criteria. They have to ask for they have to have a regulation or statute that says, well, you charge interest expense to this contract in the G&A pool. That's unallowable, but you prove to us that you didn't. You know, the statute says that's unallowable. Okay, so that's a good one. You broke GAAP. Another cash, you know, this is what if they say if they say, you know, GAAP requires you to pay all your accounts payable within 30 days. I had an auditor say that once. Well, GAAP requires. And I said, well, show me where it says that in GAAP. And he couldn't show me in the regulation, then he couldn't show me in GAAP. And so then another one is, here's the real one, unreasonable. If it's unreasonable, if they assert that it's unreasonable, then it doesn't require a statute or regulation, doesn't require GAAP. It's just, if I think it's unreasonable for you to rent anything other than economy cards, that would be an unreasonable assertion. That they can do. The other one that they do is credible documentation. If you can't prove what you're doing, then they have a right. Even the burden of proof rests on you to have credible documentation. That's where the regulation says you've got to have credible documentation, or they've got to have a statute or regulation they can refer to, or they got to be able to refer to a GAAP, or they have to insert it's unreasonable. Once they've asserted that it's unreasonable, the burden of proof shifts to the contractor. That is when it shifts to the contractor, only when they assert that it's unreasonable. And when you think about it, that makes sense. If they're going to write an audit, I mean, what an audit is an opinion by the auditors. If they're going to write an audit with an audit opinion that says you're not doing this right, then they have to be able to prove that statement. And these are the 4 criteria that the regulation says they have to use. Okay, we're actually going to wrap up early if we don't have any questions. Well, I timed this right with that video, didn't I? So, okay, all right. So what I've tried to do is just sort of give you an idea, you know, because to me, contractors go one or two ways as a general rule. They either go, no problem, I got QuickBooks, I can, and a tax accountant, I can handle this, no problem at all. Or they go the other extreme and say, I'm getting out of government contract. You scare me, I'm getting out of government contracting tomorrow. And there's some of them I have said that's a good thing to do also. Government contracting can make you money, it can do good things for you, but you have to be, and I think the accountability that's required by government contracting is a good thing for business. I think if you know what your costs, Walmart doesn't sell you a TV and not know what it costs. But the vast majority of small business government contractors in this country have no idea what it costs them to do something. When I wrote my first business plan, and this was many years ago, I said I wanted to do to other accounting firms what Walmart did to Sears. You know, because Sears didn't really know what their costs were. They had been chugging along for years. Walmart came in, knew what their costs were, knew how to get their costs down, and had the impact. Now Amazon may have done that to them. Of course, Amazon did part of it by shifting some of the burden to the consumers, because we still have to go pick up the package, right, when it's not being stolen. So that's what I'm trying to do, is give you an insight into where you fit on that risk spectrum, so that you understand how to deal with it and how to approach it. Okay, and here's just the real rule: when in doubt, call out. If and this goes all. I get questions that that are government cost accounting 101. I get those. I get ones I can 90% of the time answer off the top of my head. Then I get questions that are extremely complicated, and then I get the esoteric questions. Like I had one in GAAP. We pretty much treat the cost of getting a loan the same way we treat interest expense. You know, we pretty much expense it out, or worst case, amortize it over the length of the loan. So when I had a client call me once and say, the auditor wants to know why we claimed the expense for getting our line of credit as allowable. And I said, well, it's probably not, but let me check. And that's what I do 90% of the time, is I say, let me check. Because sure enough, something could have changed in the last 2 weeks since I checked it the last time. And in this case, something had. There was a court case that had said, of course it's allowable. It's a reasonable proof. Congress only disallowed interest. They can go ahead and spend the money to get their line of credit. We don't care whether GAAP treats it that way or not. So sometimes this stuff is esoteric. So there are websites, like my website, I think has a great deal of information on it. There's a couple other guys out there. Nick Carter out of California is another good one. Resilient, I was preparing for another training today, put something up that I'm going to have to call Steve about, because I think it's absolutely wrong about most of it, about unallowable costs. But I try and put useful information up on the website that'll help you as like, for example, LLCs. LLCs by GAAP and by tax accounting don't pay wages to owners, to members. You know, they pull out. So how do you bill the government for your time if you own an LLC? So I have an entire list of procedures on how to do that on my website. I figured when you get the really stupid questions, that's when you'll call me or call somebody else. And until then, let's get taxpayers done. And it's just mainly a judgment call, but you have to own it. You have to be willing to assume responsibility for your books of what you tell the government. You just cannot assume the things that I put about it earlier, that the government's just going to let you off the hook. I deal with this all the time. Like I said, I dealt with one, and even then it could be crazy. This contractor that just had to pay back the $88,000, they called me in August because the government wanted $350,000. So I was on a plane to Houston, 2 days later, went through it, solved the $355,000. Said, okay, we're fine. I fixed that. And I didn't worry about anything else, because according to the general ledger, the government had paid them $9.5 million on this contract. The costs were $10.2 million, so I didn't have to worry about it. Then I go back and come back 6 months later, and the government sends them a letter demanding they pay back $80,000 or $900,000, because they never paid them $9 million. They paid them $8 million. That's all they were supposed to pay them. And everything I'd seen in the general ledger and done all this work on was wrong. And I don't, I'm still dealing with that. Okay. When in doubt, call out. And the other thing is, you heard, I've been passionate here because we're among friends. And I have been accused of being passionate occasionally with DCAA auditors too, but I've never been unprofessional. These people pretty much hold your life in your hands, and you need to be professional with them. You need to be courteous with them. And there's still some of this in the guidance for timekeeping. I had an auditor yell and scream once at a contractor and I, say that each time she'd had to have a unique number on it. And I knew that it was in the guidance, which meant it was recommended but not required. And he was so wound up and so upset about this. I knew if I said it much, I would get into an argument with him. Said, okay, well, that is. I said, right, that is in the guidance. It's not in the regulation. We'll look at implementing that for next time you come out. And he said, okay. Needless to say, that was the end of the subject. All right, I think that's it.